You too. Oh, yeah. Let's get that on the calendar. Okay. Maybe even this Wednesday. Okay. All right, all right. Well, hey, again, we are continuing this series, Uphill Habits. Uphill Habits. Last week we talked about how everybody has uphill dreams, right? We've all got uphill dreams. We've all got uphill hopes, things that we hope to accomplish, places we hope to get to, things that maybe we hope to see changed or change in our lives in this new year. I mean, we've got places we want to go, things we want to do, people we want to be. We've got our dreams, right? But the problem is, though, is while most of us have uphill habits or uphill dreams, we have downhill habits, right? Like we've got the uphill dream of wanting to get out of debt, but we've got the downhill habit of every time we get stressed, running the credit card to the mall. We've got the uphill dream of wanting to get in shape, but we've got the downhill habit of as soon as we get home, we want to crash on the couch and watch football. Again, we've uphill dreams and downhill habits, right? And last week we talked about just sort of the power of these habits, the power of these habits. And habits are powerful. Literally, they shape more than hopes and dreams. So often we think that we become what we hope to become, or what we dream about becoming, or what we talk about becoming. But the reality is you become what you repeatedly do. You become your habit. In fact, I like to say it this way: we form habits, and then our habits form us. We form habits, and then our habits form us. And again, it's these habits that are incredibly powerful. I mean, they don't just go away instantly. In fact, I read a story of a guy this past week who he was in an accident, and in the process of the accident, he lost all of his memory, all of his long-term memory. So you can imagine, like, every time you meet him, it's a chance to make a first impression, right? I mean, like, he couldn't remember anything, any long-term memory. But what's amazing, he was still able to function just based on his habits. Even though the memory was gone, the habits were still there. These habits, these things that shape so much of our lives are so incredibly powerful. And last week we talked about the fact that especially when it comes to these downhill habits, if you and I hope to change these things or see something different with these downhill habits, to move upwards toward our uphill dreams, is that you can't just eliminate a habit. You can't just go cold turkey on it. No, to actually break a habit, it takes, in fact, I put on my notes this way, is it takes a habit to break a habit. It takes a habit to break a habit. Romans 12:21 puts it this way. It says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. See, it takes a habit to overcome a habit, not just any kind of habit. It takes a good habit. In fact, last week we talked about keystone habits or holy habits. Like there's actually some habits that bring an entourage with them. That bring, they have a social network with them. Like when they come into your life and when you start to live out these holy habits or these keystone habits, they affect every other habit in your life. Incredibly powerful habits. And last week we talked about the importance of establishing that keystone habit of seeking God first in our lives. Living a God first kind of life. And tonight, I want to kind of take it next level of looking at what it is to establish this habit of a new perspective. To establish the habit of a new perspective and to kind of lay the groundwork of kind of where we're going tonight. I want to share a story in Mark chapter 8. And here it's a story that even if you haven't been in church very long, most of you have probably heard some parts of it. But it's in Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 8. It says that during those days, another large crowd gathered. They had found out that Jesus was teaching, Jesus was speaking, and these crowds started to come around him. And it says, since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days. And listen, you thought I talked for a long time. This is 3 days we're talking about here. And he goes, and they have nothing to eat. And if I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. And his disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Where in this remote place, this limited place, this place that seemingly of emptiness, seemingly lacking enough, lacking any signs of ability or capability to actually provide and meet the need in this situation and in this case. Let me ask you something. How many of you know that when a lot of us face a situation, maybe not specifically like that one, but we face a trial or a circumstance or a challenge, typically there's two responses we tend to have. We either see a possibility or we see a problem. We see a possibility or we see a problem. In fact, just out of curiosity, this is a judgment-free zone. How many of you, when circumstances or challenges come your way, do you see a problem? And I'm there with you. I'm there with you. How many of you, you see potential? Yeah, all right. How many of you see potential for more problems? Right? Okay. Yeah, well, we tend to have these sort of two outlooks typically in life, especially when it comes to challenges, when it comes to trials, when it comes to circumstances, and when it comes to problems. And here's the challenge is that what I've come to discover in life, and when you read through Scripture time and time again, you discover that the problem and our potential are oftentimes at the exact same place. That oftentimes the potential that we want to see is oftentimes found on the other side of a problem. In fact, I put it in my notes this way, is that anything worthwhile in life is uphill. Anything worthwhile in life is uphill. I mean, think about it. Anything that God is really calling and really put on your heart, it's always going to be uphill. And the challenge with that is it's going to take some work. It's going to take some effort. It's going to take some challenge. It's going to take some sweat, right? We talked about it last week. It's going to take you step by step, trusting and obeying. It's going to be a little bit of work. And it's going to take you actually looking beyond the problem to see some potential. And of course, the challenge, again, with that is that to see the place that we want to get to, the place that God's called us to see it up on the top of this hill, to see it up on top of this mountain, is it can be easy to kind of look at our lives, to look at our limitations, and to look at this mountain and sit there and say, there's no way. In fact, it's the reason why a lot of us, we never step forward. The reason why so many of us, we just see a problem rather than the potential is because we look at our lives and we see the limits of our lives in comparison to the call on our lives. And we think, I can't do that. I can't make it up their way. I can't take that step. And listen, we all have limits, right? We all got limits. We got limited time, limited resources, limited abilities, limited education, maybe limited experiences. In fact, you could almost kind of describe it like this, is that every one of us, we live in a box. We live in a box. And I'm not talking about your house. I'm talking about our lives. We've got a box. We've got a box of limitations. Again, a box that's limited by a certain amount of time. We've got a box limited by a certain amount of resources. I mean, even if you're Bill Gates, even if you got tons of money, you're still limited. And listen, this box can be different sizes, sometimes way big. You can have a Bill Gates size box or one much more, this is a pretty accurate size of my box, I mean, just a smaller box. But we've got this box that we live in. And here's what I love about this story, and it kind of starts to lead us back to this idea of a new perspective, is that it's in this box, is that we can either see the limits of it, or we can see it as potential for God to use it to leverage us to that next level, to leverage us uphill. Because that's what you see in the story, right? I mean, think about it. You think that the story is that, when you think about it, they were in this remote place. They saw a place where it was just limit after limit after limit. And yet it's amazing that God took their limited resources. So some loaves, took some fish, and multiplied it. He used it as leverage. What they had, he took their box, and he leveraged it for the miraculous. And listen, that's what he does in our lives too. That's what he does in our lives too. Listen, you live, just see your box as a limit, the thing holding you back, or you can see it as the potential that God wants to use to leverage it to lead you uphill. But it all begins with this new perspective. In fact, I like how Paul puts it in Philippians. He actually kind of speaks about Philippians 4, verses 11 through 13. I wonder if we get the verse up there. He says, "For I've learned to be content, whatever the circumstances, whether in plenty or whether in want. I've learned to be content every single situation." And then it goes on, he goes, and thanks be to God, because I can do all this through him who gives me strength. In other words, it doesn't matter the size of my box. It doesn't matter how much bigger everyone else's box or how small my box is or how big it is. Listen, when Jesus is in the picture, when I understand what it is, when I give it over to God, when I surrender what I have to him, and listen, things change. I can do all things through him. I may be in a box, but that box can oftentimes be the very thing God wants to leverage to move us up the hill to that dream that he's placed in our lives, if we'd have the courage, though, to see things a little differently. Because here's the thing. I think for some of us, our new year doesn't actually start with getting a new box. See, a lot of us, what we want to move uphill is we want a new box. We want a bigger box. We want more time. We want more resources. In fact, I hear all the time people be like, hey, Pastor, I'd really get involved. I'd start serving. I'd start making a difference if and I will once I get more time, once I get that bigger box. Which, by the way, when you arrive at that place where you got more time, please let me know where that's at. Because the last time I checked, the last time I had like countless time, I was a baby. When you're a baby, you got like tons of time, right? But again, we can sit there and think that the answer to my problem is if I just had a bigger box, had a better box, something outside of my box. And yet, what if the transformation God wants to do in your life isn't outside your box, isn't about giving you a new box, but starts with a fresh perspective of the box you're in right now? Rather than giving you a new spouse, it's about giving you a fresh perspective of the spouse you currently have, of that husband and wife, and seeing them for the treasure that they are in your life, the blessing they are in your life. Instead of maybe giving you more money to get out of debt, it's maybe God's calling you to take a fresh perspective and start working with the money that you got. Rather than sitting there going and waiting, I'll get involved and I'll start serving. I'll start making a difference when I hit this mark education-wise, or I get this skill, or I get this talent, or I get this amount of time. How about just taking a step and working with what you've got? Because I'm telling you, if you'll start working with the box you've got this year, he's going to leverage it to do the miraculous in your life in 2018. But it starts with that new perspective. It starts with a new perspective. You got to start to see your box. You got to start to see your life differently. So how do we keep this box from becoming a limit and actually allow it to become leverage in our life? How do we begin to develop this new perspective in our life? And I think we start to see the answer in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. And it says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And then now we're gonna get back to that whole renewing your mind, the whole thinking part of it. But the first part I want you to really catch there is that don't conform to the pattern of this world. The pattern of this world. And this is going to kind of take us back a little bit to some of the things we talked about last week. But in fact, it was interesting. Some time ago, I watched a movie called The Imitation Game. And The Imitation Game, very interesting story. It's a story kind of documents the life in a very cinematic way. I'm sure there was a lot of liberty taken with the story, but it was about a mathematician who was set out to try to crack the code that the Nazis were using in their communication, basically to kind of position battleships against the Allied forces. And it's amazing. Eventually, it was called the Enigma Code, and he actually, after some time, actually was able to crack the code. In fact, he found that there was a kind of this pattern of 3 key elements that kind of over and over again were in this code. It's what made a difference. It's what cracked it. And listen, as a result, a lot of scholars say that because of that guy's work, because of him being able to crack the code, they were able to win the war the Allies were 2 years earlier predicted. In fact, basically saving about 14 million lives because this guy cracked the code. He cracked the code, and again, it was this code that typically had about three things. There were three kind of things that would go over and over again that he found, and here's why this is important: is because whether you realize this or not, there's a pattern in your life. There's a pattern in your life, and again, we kind of touched on this a little bit last week, but in the book, Charles Duhigg, he writes this book, Power of Habit, a great book. He actually writes about this thing called the habit cycle. The habit cycle, and it's something we all face. We all have this habit cycle, and again, it's made up of three things. Three things in terms of breaking down the code. There's a cue. There's a routine, and there's a reward. There's the cue, that's a trigger. There's something that triggers this action, triggers this habit. And then there's a routine, that's your response, that's your action to it. And then there's a reward. This is the payoff for you. So maybe an example here is maybe your cue is stress. Is stress or just feeling overwhelmed. And maybe your routine or your response is watching football. And then your reward would be like an escape from that, right? Maybe your cue, the alarm goes off. Maybe your routine is get coffee, and your reward is for others that you don't kill them and they can actually understand what you're saying, right? Again, we've got these patterns, though. We've got these patterns, and what you got to understand is that the problem is in the pattern for a lot of us. And this is so significant because, listen, going back to that story in the imitation game, he was able to win the war because he was able to crack the code. He saw the pattern that was at play in their life. And listen, I think for some of us, if we want to experience some breakthrough in 2018, we've got to understand the pattern. We've got to understand this pattern in our lives. That we've got some habits that are forming us. We got some habits that are shaping us. We got some habits that are building this box around us. Because I think, unfortunately, so often we love to just kind of rest on excuses. When it comes to, we've got these dreams and we got all these things we hope to do, and this year becomes next year and becomes a year after that because we make one excuse after the next partially because of excuses built around the box. We think, well, she did this to me, they did that to me, they said this, they did that, and everything is around our box, and we think that's the cause of the box that we have. We think that's the cause of where we're at in life. But listen to what Paul says. Paul says, no, the problem is the pattern. It's not all the stuff out here. It's the pattern. It's your habits. The good, the bad, the ugly habits that you and I have that are forming so much of this box. And listen, don't get me wrong. I know that there's tragedies, there's heartaches, there's things that happen that are beyond your control. But even with that, you've got control on how you respond to it, right? And so much of this box, you've got to understand, is something we build up. And unfortunately, I think too many of us, we want to just kind of stay in the box, see it as a limitation because we just want to use it as an excuse. And we love excuses. We love excuses. I remember I was in Wisconsin, and I was ice fishing with a guy. Talk about being in a literal box. You're in this tiny box that's about this size, looking at a hole. It doesn't even feel like fishing. It feels more like a video game because you're just watching this little like beeper thing and hoping to catch a fish. But anyway, you got nothing but time. So maybe I should take that back when I said the time I had the most time was when I was a baby, and then it would be ice fishing because, man, it just seemed like time moved so slow. And so I remember there was a guy there, and he told me a joke, and I don't really know if it was a joke or it was actually the story of his life. I mean, he was kind of a pretty eclectic fellow, but he told me a Franz joke, and Franz joke is kind of a Wisconsinite thing. But the Franz joke basically is like, there was this guy, Franz, and he was out hunting one day, and he was on his way back, and he was kind of swerving all the way back home. And this police officer pulls him over, and of course the police officer knew him. He had seen Franz many a times, and he's like, Franz, what are you doing? And Franz like, I'm just heading home, And the police officer like, why are you swerving so much? Why are you going zigzag and all that. He goes, oh, nothing. I'm just, just heading home, And the police officer was like, well, I'm going to have to give you a breathalyzer test, just to make sure. And Franz goes, well, you can't do that because I got asthma and I would die right here if you did that. So you can't do that. And police officer goes, well, I'm going to have to give you a blood test. And he goes, well, you can't do that. I'm a hemophiliac. I could bleed, to death all over your police station. I mean, that's not going to happen. And police officer's like, well, I'm going to take you back and do a urine test. And he's like, well, I can't do that. I'm a diabetic. And the police officer's like, well, he goes, well, this is one you can do. You're going to have to walk the line. Just walk a straight line. And Franz goes, well, I can't do that. I'm drunk. Just kidding. It sounded a lot better when you're ice fishing and you've got nothing better to do. When you're ice fishing, any joke sounds amazing. So, but again, so often we allow these excuses. And listen, I'm just telling you, you've got to own your box. You've got to own your box or your box is going to own you. It is. You got to, rather than always blaming everyone and everything, blaming your mom, blaming your dad, blaming your history, blaming this and that, listen, you got